Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you for the invitation also to Adrien and Alex. It's a pleasure to be here in this place, which is partially at least my home. When Bruno asked me to address this topic a few months ago, I asked him, I begged him to give me a sexier topic than this one. Not because I don't think that ratification is sexy. I think it's very sexy. But there are two aspects that perhaps made it not so sexy in the context of this conference. The first is that ratification of the new treaties is not completed yet. So whatever we can say is highly provisional at this stage. And the second thing that I would like to underline is that ratification says little about the crisis, but the crisis says a lot about ratification. And that's the way I want to construct my presentation, is about ratification rules and how the crisis has impinged on the very traditional way to construct this in the European Union. And what I intend to do for this, I have, as you can see, I have a PowerPoint, but I have also a structure behind the PowerPoint. What I want to do in my presentation is basically three things, perhaps because the political scientists are always under the influence of this biblical triadic structure. First, I would like to revise the functioning of the European Union ratification process from the early 80s until 2010, meaning the Lisbon Treaty. And I will do that very quickly following a forthcoming book, which will be appearing next year. And here I would like to take three points. First, what have been the traditional theoretical views on ratifications? And the second is a nuanced approach to this theoretical view that tries to bring into the discussion the importance of the institutions. It's a classical statement, institutions do matter, and specifically by institution, in this specific case, I mean a very precise institution, which is the rule of unanimity. And following from that, I will try to present the strategies that actors have followed to achieve successful ratification, always moving within the old regime. And from that, I want to move to the changing game that has been released by the new treaties. And these new treaties, what they have established is first, new requirements for ratification, which are absolutely a novelty within the European Union, but also, which is also worth mentioning, and Bruno said something about that in his presentation, there is a strong linkage between entering into force of these different treaties. Second, I will mention something about the domestic procedures chosen to ratify the three treaties that we'll be speaking about. And thirdly, I will make some mention about the effects of those changing rules. And whatever I say about the effects will be very little because, as I said, the treaties have not been completed yet in terms of the ratification. And finally, the third part of my presentation will be only one slide, very brief. I would like to do something which is very damaging in academic terms, but nevertheless I cannot resist the temptation, which is to do some kind of prognosis. Out of the confronting of the first model, which is the traditional EU ratification instrument, and the second model, the new rules emerging, what we can assess for the future? What will be the forthcoming rules for the future? Bruno says something in terms of the overall structure, and I will try to say something about the kind of ratification rules we are going to have in the future. Now, for the first point, theoretical views on ratifications. Let me start with an assumption that I think no one will contest, that is that European constitutionalization has advanced systematically through revision of existing treaties. There has not been an attempt to create an alternative order outside the treaties, nor even with the European Convention that acted as a revision of existing treaties. For this, it's very important then to take into account what theories of ratification says, and of course the basic theory in this domain is Putnam two-level games logic. And as you know, Putnam distinguishes between level 1 negotiation, level 2 ratification. But the question here is that the emphasis in Putnam construction goes very much to the constraint that ratifiers can put on negotiators. So if ratifiers have got a strong veto power, this conditions negotiators and reduces what is called the win set. And this lack of interest with a specific process of ratification led to further specifications that try to explain partial defection. Why, if we have domestic players with a veto capacity that can influence negotiators, nevertheless, assuming that, that both of them are in communication, nevertheless, defection happens. Why ratification fails? And the two specifications we find in theory speak either of imperfect information, meaning that those negotiators do not have perfect information about the preferences of domestic actors, or else they speak about divided government, meaning that there is a change in the composition of the government that may a treaty fail. Now, what is my criticism of this theoretical field? Very easily and very clearly state is the importance of institutions. And this ratification theorization does not take into account at all what are the level 1 rules, the rules established at the level of negotiation, meaning the framing rules established in treaties, and how these rules can affect the outcome. And by focusing in domestic preferences exclusively, the explanation for successful ratification always follows the structure of a successful accumulation of different national processes without any kind of connection. Now, this may work in some cases in the European Union, and specifically in some cases there are very good case studies explaining that, for instance, on the Treaty on Amsterdam, but nevertheless, it goes against some intuitions, some theoretical institutions. Those actors do not take into account any role for the unanimity principle, and this goes against what constitutional political economy have said. Constitutional economy drawing out of Buchanan and Tulloch, but following from a number of authors. Those authors will argue that in normative terms, unanimity is essential because it secures the highest level of consensus between all participating actors. So for the foundational norms, unanimity is essential. But then they argue that in empirical terms, unanimity renders agreement and ratification very difficult because there is an incentive always to break down the game and to try to extract as many concessions as possible. And nevertheless, the paradox here is that despite of this conception, the European Union has been able to ratify under unanimity 9 treaties, not less than 9 treaties. And I'm speaking only about revision treaties, and it's right that Bruno could point to the collateral treaties that can be also included. So the question for me is to explain why treaties are ratified under unanimity rule in which there is a strong incentive to defend. And my argument here, my thesis here, is that differently to the traditional aggregation, accumulation of national preference, what is important is to look at the actor strategies trying to achieve a given outcome. And this is a decisive explanatory element in my construction. What I have arguing, and you will find that in the book once it comes out, is that there are 3 elements in actors' strategies that are really, really important. The first one, that actors try to eliminate elements in a treaty that could activate domestic actors, with a veto power capacity. And also, domestic actors, what they can do and they try to do is to steer the domestic ratification procedures in a way that try to bypass domestic actors, whenever this is possible. What happens when these alternatives reduce? There are 2 further instruments there. One is timing. Domestic actors, by that I mean mainly governments, not exclusively governments, but mainly governments, what they try to do is to create a specific timing of ratification among countries in the way that can force the impression of a sequence that leads unavoidably to a given outcome. And this is very clear in some cases that we'll mention afterwards. And secondly, very, very important, I think it's a key element there, framing. Actors try to construct a given situation in a way that gives sense to the actions. What do I mean by that? Under unanimity, we could argue that once there is a single failure in one single state, a treaty is over, a treaty is finished. And nevertheless, we know that there are a lot of cases in the European Union, let's refer to Maastricht, let's refer to Lisbon, let's refer to Nice, in which, nevertheless, this initial failure, treaties were ratified. One of the essential elements for that is framing, constructing the situation in a way that justifies further action in a given direction. And the basic elements for framing are sentences, frames such as the treaty is dead, the treaty is not dead. Ratification process should continue, ratification process should not continue. In certain situations, this creates a high degree of uncertainty. This is the case, for instance, after the failure of the referendums in France and the Netherlands. There was a huge rush to try to build these interpretations of the situation. I insist, this framing is highly important because if one interprets the rule strictly, when there is a no, the game is over. And it doesn't happen like that. Okay? So what are the results that I have found? There are three possible outcomes. One is the cases in which you have full successful ratification, and in these cases there are 4 treaties: the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty, the European Economic Community Treaty, the Single European Act, and Amsterdam. And here the kind of strategies you have are highly evident. I would say that in case of successful ratification, my model adds a little bit, but not much, to existing knowledge. I accept that criticism. And the two basic elements here are the elimination a priori of issues that can be damaging, activating domestic veto players, and also discretionary management of procedures and timing. This is very important. Very clearly, in the case of the initial Paris Treaty, which is normally presented in the narrative as the big event in which there was a huge consensus, and you look at the negotiation of this treaty, the ratification was only possible in certain countries, meaning France, for instance, because the government put next to the ratification a vote of confidence. So there's a very strong assertive leadership in favor of ratification that perhaps we forget when we look at the current situation. Out of these four treaties, only the Amsterdam probably is the less contentious of all of them, perhaps next to the here. Second outcome, successful ratification with partial failure. And here you have several cases, Maastricht, Nice, and Lisbon. And here the question is how these treaties that had some kind of rejection in one national veto player were able to be ratified. And here the important elements in my construction is, first, the prevalence of a strong framing, a strong rhetorical construction, a strong narrative by governmental actors, but not only by governmental actors, in favor of continuing with ratification and in sustaining that the treaty was not over. And then, very importantly, the creation of a decisive sequence of events. What I mean by that is not only rhetoric what plays an important role here, is that the actors had to commit in different countries to continue with ratification to the point that one initial defection is turned at the end at the only defection. And that changed very much the rules of the game. And finally, failed ratification. Here we have is the reverse sequence. Prevalence of the anti-ratification frame. You look at the declarations immediately after the French and Dutch referendum, and you will have immediately a cascade of leaders speaking about the death of the treaty, ratification is over, the treaty is going nowhere. And next to that, the creation of a sequence of events that effectively cancel the possibility of ratification. I'm not only speaking about the two referendums, I'm speaking about the decision of the British government not to keep the ratification, going to shelve the treaty, the decision of the German Federal Court to put on hold its decision on the treaty itself, and so on and so forth. This created a situation in which the credibility of the possibility of ratification was dead. Why this is important? Because, again, under unanimity, one single instance will be enough to kill a treaty, and nevertheless, what we see is that this has been engineered to create a sequence of several events rather than only one. Now, what are the conclusions I want to extract from this? First, the number of domestic actors intervening with and without veto capacity has increased dramatically. And I think I have here a table. It's a very simplified table in which I have eliminated a number of figures. But if you look at, of course, the number of states has increased. But look at the number of chambers from 11 initially to 43 in the last round in the Lisbon Treaty. Referendums does not show a clear pattern, but nevertheless there is a tendency to increase them. Court cases from 0 to 12. And court cases are important because they activate eventually another procedure which will be constitutional reforms. And constitutional reforms have normally they have enhanced requirements to proceed with ratification. As you can see, there is also a certain tendency to the growth of constitutional reform. So the situation is that there is a huge increase in the number of eventual veto players intervening in ratification. If you aggregate horizontally, this simplified table in which I have, for instance, excluded things like intervening elections, like for instance, the role of eventually of regional governments and so on and so forth, the number of veto players has increased dramatically over time. Now, coming back, second conclusion that we can extract from this process from 1959 to 2010, the creation of a very strong lock-in procedure, which is the fact that the revision of unanimity rule can only be done by unanimity. So that creates probably the most rigid revision procedure that exists ever. I don't have any kind of alternative model that can be compared with the European Union one. And then, and that's what I think is really relevant, is under unanimity and increasing domestic veto players, failure of ratification is increasingly likely, and actors need to engineer pro-ratification strategies. That goes to say that it's not enough to take into account preferences, but also how those processes are articulated. Now, what it does say in relation to the current situation? Well, the question is that what I have seen so far does not explain anything now, because the rules have changed dramatically. And the rules have changed dramatically, and I will refer to the three main treaties, which are the European Stability Mechanism, the Fiscal Compact, and of course revision of Article 136. Bruno said that it was not important. I will nuance a little bit this statement. Of course, the first agreement, the European Financial Stability Facility, has not been treated really as a treaty, although it's highly important in these terms. The decisions by the national parliaments to provide the national funds allocated to this facility. Now, for the other three treaties, what we have is a strong asymmetry between them. First, Article 136 goes through the ordinary procedure for revision, and that means unanimity and remission to domestic constitutional procedures. For the Fiscal Compact, what you have is, for the first time, I would say in history, because there was something of insinuation in the old European Colonial Steel Community Treaty, but for the first time, a less than unanimity rule. 12 out of 16 Euro member states, and for this count, non-Euro states are not taken into account. And for the European Stability Mechanism, what you have not a minimum number of member states, but rather a threshold of the fixed contribution in terms of the capital to the fund, which is 90%. This 90% corresponds to strictly corresponds to 7 states in the minimum possibility. Now, the other interesting thing about these three treaties, and I'm going to show you perhaps first this figure, which is very simple, and I'm not very good with these things. The other interesting thing about these three treaties, they are linked among them in terms of the value of the respective ratification. So I have added here also the European Financial Stability Facility, because it will be absorbed, whatever is left will be absorbed by the European Stability Mechanism, but it's not really a treaty. Perhaps the interesting interactions are between the other two treaties. Now, what are the interactions? First, revision of Article 136 permits the creation of a European Stability Mechanism, but strictly speaking, the treaty that establishes the European Stability Mechanism does not need an authorization for the European Union. It's an international law instrument, hence does not require that. However, the interesting thing here is two things. First, the European Council decision establishing the revision of Article 136 refers to this stability mechanism. So someone could argue that there is some ground in European law to create this external mechanism. And more interesting, the Pringle case that has been already quoted has raised in front of the European Court of Justice two very interesting questions. Particularly, I think it's interesting the second. The first is whether a member state of the Euro is entitled to sign such an agreement and to ratify it. I think it's a perhaps not so interesting question, but the interesting one is the second, is whether the European Council decision is, if it's held valid, is the entitlement of a member state to enter into and ratify the Treaty on the Stability, European Stability Mechanism, subject to the entering into force of the decision. What the Irish Constitutional Court is saying, do we need to have a previous revision of Article 136 before we can ratify the Treaty on the European Stability Mechanism? And the facts are already going in one direction. This treaty is the only one that has been ratified already. It's completed and has entered into force. So my prognosis on that, very easy to do, of course, is that the European Court of Justice will say no. The response will be no, because, of course, the court will calculate the enormous political effects to say, yes, we need first to have Article 136 revised and then the other treaty enter into force. Second element of linkage, the ratification of the Fiscal Compact is the condition for acceding to the funds of the European Stability Mechanism. And third element of linkage, which has been mentioned by Bruno, is that there is a provision for merging the Stability Compact with the ordinary European Union treaties. Now, what can I say about the procedures that have been used in member states? It's really interesting, but because in a nutshell, what you have here, and I don't know how I am with my time, Bruno? It's up. Okay. So very quickly, what you have here is that member states what have done is basically to reduce the number of veto players intervening in the ratification on each of these treaties. I have here the description, so if the time is up, I don't go much more into detail on that. But in all cases, what you have is a reduction of the number of veto players. Now, what can be said, having explained the new rules and having explained the domestic ratification procedures, what can we say about the game that has been developed? Very little. Some time ago in March, I was asked to try to say something about what would happen with ratification. And the only thing I could come across, and partially has been fulfilled, is A, the European Stability Mechanism Treaty could be approved because it's the one with the lowest threshold, 7%, provided that Germany commits in terms of ratification with this treaty. And in fact, it's the only treaty that has been ratified. Only 7 members were needed, and once the treaty enters into force for the rest of the members, there is an incentive to join in ratifying this treaty. The interesting thing was more related to the stability treaty, in which my hypothesis has been totally confirmed, is that the kind of incentive that the stability treaty creates are different for different groups of states. The stability treaty, as you know, the fiscal compact, sorry about that, the fiscal compact has as a basic component the golden rule, apart from another number of elements, but the other elements are already existing under ordinary EU legislation, meaning the CSIC. And the golden rule is particularly important for those states who are require some kind of market credibility for their public debt. So my hypothesis is that those countries who are also the ones who could really apply for funds from the European Stability Mechanism will be the first ones to ratify the treaty. Why? Because this treaty requires only 12 member states. And what you have here is the order in which they ratify the treaty. And you can see that all the countries with a program, with a bailout program, or with a weaker fiscal position, were the first, in the middle column, were the first to ratify. There is not, of course, a perfect order there. The only exception is Ireland, and this can be partially explained by the referendum. I want to call you the attention to the red cell there, which is only located in the case of the Czech Republic. I'm sorry it went down to the United Kingdom. Why? The Czech Republic is not a Euro country and has not signed the fiscal compact and is not part of the other treaty. But nevertheless, if you remember the Pringle case brought about by the Irish Supreme Court, there is a question asking whether entering into force of this treaty is required to give efficacy to the European Stability Mechanism. And as you know, the Czech Republic has got a semi-veto player, which is the president, who has been using what I will call perhaps a not very clearly defined constitutional position to assert a kind of veto in the sense of prolonging as much as possible, delaying as much as possible the signature of any treaty ratified by the Czech Parliament. This is happening again. It happened with the European Union Constitution, it happened with the Lisbon Treaty, and it's happening again with this treaty. Now, the outcome probably will be that he will sign the treaty and no effects will be felt. But nevertheless, what this speaks of is that the ratification is again the display collectively when unanimity is intervening. We shouldn't not think only in terms of the German Federal Constitutional Court, probably is the most important actor in this game, but it's not the only actor. It's not the only actor. There are very interesting examples about how the Lisbon Treaty shows some degree of coordination among Eurosceptic actors trying to prevent ratification. Now, to conclude, because I'm running late, my conclusion will be that having into account the increased number of veto players in member states, and having in particular in mind the position of the United Kingdom, particularly after the approval of the 2010 Referendum Act that forces the government to pass through a referendum significant treaty revisions, and having into account also the discovery of these easier revision procedures, my prognosis for the future is that it's more likely that new European Union treaties, and I don't mean revision treaties, proceed through this new procedure. That means also proceeding outside of the European Union treaty framework. I think it's becoming increasingly possible, and we'll see what's going to happen in the next months with with the new agreements being negotiated. So thank you very much, and I apologize for being so quick in my speech. I missed some of the slides. Thank you.